Welcome to the Deep Change Podcast, where we explore the future of human potential through psychology, brain tech, and pushing the boundaries of neuroplasticity. I'm your host, James Garrett, and today we have the honor of having Dave Rabin on the show. Dave is an MD, PhD in neuroscience and psychiatry, and is the Chief Innovation Officer, co-inventor, and co-founder of Apollo Neuroscience. As a psychiatrist and translational neuroscientist, Dr. Rabin specializes in developing novel and non-invasive therapies for treatment-resistant physical and mental illness. His research focuses on chronic stress from the cellular and molecular level to the body as a whole. Dr. Rabin works to identify new healthcare markets, to evaluate Apollo's real-world efficacy through clinical trials, and to guide development of the Apollo technology. This is a guy who has the heart, brains, and passion to make all of our lives a little better by reducing our stress and increasing our focus. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, James. I really appreciate you having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited for this. This is, we met through a mutual friend. Was it Haleli? Am I remembering right?
It was.
Azulay, yeah.
Yes.
So I was on Haleli's podcast, and she connected Dave and I last year. And I've just been fascinated by what Dave and his team are building at Apollo Neuroscience. And I think maybe the place to start is about the topic of stress. You know, why do you guys, how do you see the problem that you're tackling? I think I understand it as stress, but you guys may understand it differently. But why are you tackling how do you define the problem you're tackling, and why are you sort of tackling that particular problem?
That's a great question. I think, there's a lot of vagueness around the word stress because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. The best way to really characterize stress is to go back to the autonomic nervous system, which is part of the nervous system we really don't think about very much, but it's critical to the management of everything that goes on in our bodies in the background, from your heart rate to your breathing rate to your blood pressure to the stiffness of your blood vessels to your immune system, your digestion, everything that sort of runs in the background of your body that you don't have to attend to all the time is controlled by this nervous system. And so the nervous system, this particular part of the nervous system is really critical because in that part of the nervous system, it's a dynamic balance between stress and safety. And so, and by stress, I mean fear, real fear, threat of physical injury or mental, emotional injury or death, those kinds of things, which we call, colloquially fight or flight responses. And so the sympathetic system, the stress response part of that system, is responsible for all of the fight or flight responses, and it's supposed to be activated in large part when we're in situations like running from a bear or from an immediate threat to our survival. But the problem is, and the system works very well when it's activated specifically for those things in the moment, because in those moments, you don't want to be thinking about your digestion or your reproduction or your creativity or your sleep. You need to get out of that situation as quickly as possible.
Right.
And so what happens is you enter this acutely sympathetic, high fight or flight, high stress state. And then in that state, all of the stuff that your body does when you're not stressed out, that's controlled by the parasympathetic side of the nervous system, which is the rest, digestion, creativity, reproduction, all immunity, all those things, get suppressed. And so the regulation of all those activities is reduced, and the focus is get out of this stressful situation, fight, flight, freeze, whatever you need to do. The problem is when those stress responses are perpetuated over time. So stress times time is really where the issue starts to set in. All of the health issues start to set in is because you end up having this, what we call like a tonic or persistent increase in activity in the sympathetic nervous system, which causes a tonic or perpetual decrease in parasympathetic activity. And so all of the systems in your body start to dysfunction that are related to safety or that require safety to work. So, you know,
Fascinating.
so when you're chronically stressed, it's hard to be creative. It's hard to be focused. It's hard to get good sleep and wind down quickly before bed, and to, you know, reliably adjust your schedule and your appetite and adjust to changing situations in the environment. And so by adjusting activity in that nervous system, we can influence directly how we respond to all of these things and how our body is working, or how well our body is working. So a lot of the techniques that we teach people in our clinic and in general, and that we practice ourselves, are to balance activity in the autonomic nervous system between sympathetic and parasympathetic, so that we are achieving our maximal recovery states when we're not threatened, and we can quickly transition back to a feeling of safety and recovery when the threat is gone. But when the threat's present, you quickly adjust to it. You do what you need to do, and you adapt to the situation and move on. But the stress, thoughts, and the things associated with the situation end as soon as the threat is gone. And so that's really what is what we call resilience, which is this, you know, ideal balance state between parasympathetic and sympathetic that facilitates a more healthy, in generally healthy life, mentally, physically, and emotionally.
Right. And the main idea in terms of kind of understanding the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic is that am I right in understanding that when one is on, the other is off? Or how do you how does that work?
Yes, I think that's a generally good way to understand it.
Yeah.
But it's not the complete story. So,
Sure.
in general, when you are in those situations where you're running from a bear and you are in a desperate fight or flight survival situation, what happens is that your parasympathetic system shuts down to a large extent. It doesn't ever, or almost never, completely shuts down.
Mm-hmm.
None of these systems almost ever completely shut down, because they're required for survival and thriving in your life. So they're always kind of active, but it's just that the proportionate amount of activity is changed. Interestingly enough, over the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a lot of research looking into states of high sympathetic and parasympathetic activity, which have a lot of different names. These states are often called flow states, or peak performance states, or peak experience states, where people experience or describe experiencing things like maximal presentness, focus, attention, and maximal emotion control, but also excitement and arousal and energy and productivity. And it's something that we have all probably experienced in some ways in our day-to-day lives when we're doing things we really like to do, when we're really focused and present in the moment with those things. However, achieving those states can be difficult, particularly when we're doing things that we don't like to do. And so, and that's something many of us are very familiar with. So the trick of balancing your nervous system is to help you adapt to those kinds of stressors where you're facing something that you don't want to do, or something that you shouldn't feel like you have to do, and that causes an inordinate amount of stressful thoughts in your brain, and you can have those thoughts, or you can, well, you know, for lack of a better term, sort of flow with them or past them to the actual solution. And so by practicing these nervous system balancing activities like meditation, mindfulness, and deep breathing, and yoga, and massage, and biofeedback, etc., all of these different techniques are different ways to sort of help increase the resilience of the body over time that allows a smoother transition between these states.
That allows us to move through those states more fluidly or flexibly. Is that
right?
how you're thinking about it?
Yeah.
Got it.
So the speed and the fluidity with which you transition is accentuated. Effectively, your ability to react to the threat is immediate and strong, and you're more likely to get out of that situation and find safety. And then when you find safety, you're more likely to calm down quickly and adjust to that environment. So you're not constantly thinking about your trauma for days, months, years later.
When you've built up stress resilience, is that the idea that there's sort of like I'm almost thinking of it as the opposite of kind of stress buildup, or what I hear scientists call allostatic load, right?
Right.
I almost think of it as like the opposite. And Rick Hansen at UC Berkeley talks a lot about this, where it's sort of like you're building up. Barbara Fredrickson, there's a whole bunch of people sort of diving into this kind of space of building these kind of stress or sort of resilience reservoirs.
Yep.
And is that sort of how you think of it as well?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. I mean, I think, you know, there's a certain amount of reserve effectively that you can build up. You know, when we really think about approaching situations, you know, if you think about a situation that makes you stressed out, what do you bring to the table, and what is coming to the table or already at the table when you get there, right? So the things that you have control over are what you bring to the table. The things that you don't necessarily have control over are what's already on the table when you get there. And so ultimately, the more prepared you are, and in terms of the things that you can control when you come in, and that goes for your, you know, resiliency reserves, or however you want to describe it, the more prepared you are, the better you're going to respond to that stressful experience, whatever that may be, because you're going to be more clear-headed and thoughtful rather than panicking. And we know that panicking never really solves anything. So I think that I mean, we can do it, and we do it a lot, but it's not necessarily something that's constructive or productive to get us out of a situation or help us make good decisions. So
specifically not making good decisions. It's very helpful to get us like running, but it's a physical, that's a physical response, not a cognitive response, right? And decision making is very much cognitive activity.
Right. And so the decision making, more than just fighting or flying out of a situation, the decision making about how do you respond to your boss when they look at you funny in a meeting is different, right? There needs to be a much more conscious effort in terms of the way that you interact with those experiences, so that you don't cause an undesired outcome. And so, because those are not simple running from a bear situations, right? Those are much more intricate situations that require more finesse. And most of us who work in those environments that require those kinds of skills, we've been trained to do them, and we are good at them when we're in the moment. But when we're in our heads thinking about how people are judging us, or us judging ourselves, it automatically impairs our ability to be present and focused and perform at our best. Right. And so that's really what all of these practices of mindfulness and meditation and all the things that you've been talking about on your show to enhance your brain health are really in large part about enhancing this constant balance between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems to build up your reserves, so that when you go into these situations, you're more prepared. You know, and I think one of the things that always fascinated me about this kind of question that you just asked, which is, and sort of led me down this field, was, why do some people get sick and why do some people not? Even though some people who don't get sick end up having much more stress in their lives than others. And that's the same for physical and mental illness, right? Why do some people who are extremely traumatized in their youth overcome it and become fantastic superstars in society and their lives in general? And why do other people wind up in and out of mental institutions not able to cope? And so those are the questions that start to lead us to think, well, maybe there's something else going on here.
Fascinating. The way you've described that, Dave, with sort of, I sort of think of it as making deposits into my emotional bank account or my brain bank account, or sort of investing. Most of the way we're running our day isn't thinking of our body and our brain as like a biological system that needs inputs, namely restorative or recharging inputs, right? We all are, a good portion of us are underslept. We give ourselves inputs, but often the kinds of inputs that create long-term problems, like, caffeinated beverages that are highly sugared, and, a whole host of things that get us that little energy boost in the short term, but of course create long-term problems with diabetes and a whole host of other problems. So in many ways, I hear what you're saying as kind of the scientific justification for self-care, of actually like taking the intentional time to meditate, to do yoga, to take an afternoon nap if necessary, which I love, or any other series of things that actually restore, and that it's not, these aren't, I think culturally we think that time away from work is essentially wasted, right? It's not productive.
Right.
It's a very kind of knit into our American culture that, like, if you're not actively doing something, and physically that usually looks like you're behind a screen at your computer or whatever,
Right.
that you're not actually being productive. And I find this balance, this kind of hyper productivity culture, to be at odds with the science around how, ironically, to be the most productive, because you're literally over time burning out the very capacity to stay focused over time. Do you see it that way, or how do you see it?
Yeah, I would say you hit it right on the nail. Our society teaches us, and I think that's part of, I think that might be the best way to sum up why it's so hard to be an adult in America these days, is because we live in an area, in a time of enlightened information because of the internet, where we can literally access anything we want at any time. And so all this information that you just talked about how the scientific literature thoroughly justifies a different kind of lifestyle than what we are currently living or what we've been taught, kind of forces us to take a step back and say, wait a minute, does that mean I'm supposed to relearn and reteach myself everything that I was taught as a child growing up, from like my most basic coping strategies to the way that I think about the world? And the answer is yes. Yeah. But that is a really, really difficult thing for a lot of people to come to terms with, because it's a daunting task to feel like you have to all of a sudden re-educate and retrain your entire brain. Because you were raised in a way that wasn't consistent with how to live the most healthy lifestyle. But ultimately, that's basically what we're up against as humans right now. Is we're in the information revolution, where we're able to access any information we want. And then the real question that comes out of that is, once we have that information about what we're doing wrong and how we can be better, what are we actually doing about it? And a lot of people are not doing anything because it's just they're as you said, they're too inundated with work and trapped in this mindset where if they're not working and being productive in the traditional capitalist sense or societal sense of what productive means, then they're wasting their time. But ultimately, there's, how we can look. We don't need to look at the data, but if you just take a quick look at the data of what's coming out from health and wellness reports around the country, and illness reports, you can clearly see that the way we're going about it is not working. We have the highest rates of substance abuse ever in our country. We have some of the highest rates of mental illness ever in our country, particularly depression, which is directly correlated with burnout. 30% of medical students are meeting criteria for depression, and 42% and upward of medical residents are reporting that they meet criteria for depression and have suicidal ideation within the last 6 months.
Really?
And so, and that extends over to entrepreneurs and lots of other groups of people that are experiencing these rapidly increasing rates of burnout. And so when we see, and then again, right, we have this information available to us as a scientific and a community and as a community at large. And then the real question comes, what do we do about it now that we know? And so our take on this whole idea was, let's create something that takes all of the best parts of treatments that work for people based on what we understand about the autonomic nervous system and balance in general, and everything we've learned from Eastern medicine and everything we've learned from Western medicine, and try to put that into a therapy that people can take with them on the go that can help them feel more regulated and more able to adapt to stress in their day-to-day lives, even if they don't necessarily have 10,000 hours to practice to become a master meditator.
Right.
So,
right. It's a depressing number, right? I just read Altered Traits a few months ago by Richie Davidson and Daniel Goleman, and you see the science behind these, lifelong meditators, and it's truly impressive, right?
Absolutely.
But it's also, for the average person who has a family and a job and kind of lives not in that kind of, a lot of them, are in monasteries or in, they sort of have taken on that role of being a monk or other things that sort of
Right.
give them that capacity to spend those thousands and thousands and thousands of hours training their minds, and their brains. And it is a question, a kind of troubling / difficult question to ask. Okay, so what about the rest of us?
Right.
How do
Right.
we can meditate for, I meditate every morning, and I meditate often 1 or 2 additional times in the afternoon. But all in all, I don't meditate more than 30 minutes a day. And on average, it's probably around 10 minutes a day,
Right. Same.
So I use my Headspace app, just like everybody else, who's doing this sort of thing. We've all got our sort of meditation app, and I find it enormously beneficial, and I love it. But then I'm also sort of in that place where I can see that I'm very much a beginner, even though I've been doing it for, a couple of years now, and still see very, they do see the changes, but I'm like, wow, I want those bigger changes.
Right. Right. And that was a huge important point for us, is how, when it really comes down to the rest of us who do live these crazy, hectic lives that are all over the place, and we're constantly overwhelmed and bouncing from, A to B to C, et cetera, how do you add something in that doesn't require much, if any, effort on the user's part, but still provides these benefits of being able to enhance nervous system balance, like meditation or mindfulness, and then over time also improve your ability to master and access those states? Because what we're really talking about is states that are essential. Like, you have to feel safe to enter these states effectively. And one of the biggest problems for people trying to enter meditative states, just like trying to enter relationships or even intimate experiences, is that you have to feel safe to be able to engage completely in that experience, to be able to lean into your meditation or lean into your relationship with somebody. There has to be trust in yourself, trust in the other person, trust in the experience. And there has to be some preliminary work that's done along the way that I think we often neglect, some of which we've talked about before, involving, for example, like the 4 pillars of Buddhism, that help form this foundation of trust in yourself that allows you to be able to make much greater strides. But if you try to just jump right into meditation or mindfulness without having built up the foundation first, then you're going to collapse, and you're going to experience a very difficult and arduous path. And so what we're really trying to do with Apollo is provide this wearable benefit to people, where you can have the experience of safety that allows you to more fluidly adapt to these situations, which similarly is not just from stress to not stress, it's also from stress to meditation. Being able to enter a meditative state is a strong state change experience. And so we do see a lot of people using Apollo who are expert meditators and naive meditators who've had dramatic experiences in terms of being able to boost their access to meditative states more quickly, because they just feel safer and more able to lean into those experiences. And that's the same whether it's social anxiety or whether it's you just trying to go to sleep, fall asleep in your own bed next to your partner or by yourself. All of it is centered around this core idea of being able to lean into a safe situation, which allows your body to re-engage all of its normal and maintenance activities at a regular pace.
Gosh, I love that. I love the idea that if your body can't get into a safe, if your body is sort of sending signals to your brain, essentially, right, that it's unsafe, then it can't actually execute or perform certain critical functions, which is why we see, chronic problems. I mean, I'm speaking from personal experience. When we were in the Middle East building, we were social entrepreneurs, and but had a big staff. We raised $1 million. It was the whole thing. We were running this big ship, and it was enormously stressful, and I wasn't coping well. Meaning, I was coping with Pepsi and binging out on Netflix at night. I mean, like literally, like it like when I think back, to that time in our lives. I'm still the same person. I'm still like the same operating equipment. And yet when I get stressed now, the coping strategies I go to look way different and so
Right.
I'm trying to get the exact same effect, which is stress relief, which is sort of a sense of calm, a sense
Right.
of control. And yet it's actually just like a micro choice, which over time becomes an entrenched habit that pushes me toward these really big outcomes. I came home from Jordan with adrenal fatigue and a whole host of problems in my body because of burnout. I
Yeah.
was literally burned out. We did some testing and the doctor basically said, no, you've got like all the signs of burnout. And so this is partly why I'm so passionate about this. So I don't want to go too much more into my story. I feel the resonance because I want to jump right into you've mentioned Apollo and what you guys are trying to do there, and I just find it so powerful. Tell me.
Thank you.
Tell me, and I've just been. You're welcome. Yeah, you're welcome. I've actually been. Dave graciously sent me one of their beta products. The products aren't out on the market yet, but they're in a beta testing phase, and so I've been using it and just experiencing it for myself. One of the things that I find is a handful of things. This is just my kind of raw user experience. One is that it's very, very easy to use. It looks like a watch, essentially. So you strap it onto your wrist or onto your ankle. And then it again syncs with an app. And I particularly am liking the app choices that are about soothing or calming or relaxing. And maybe that my stress just tends to run high. I don't really know, but those are the ones that I tend to like the most. And for me, again, the experience sort of feels like this low level I can't think of it. It feels like a cat purring, like on my wrist, like if you've ever been next to a cat that's purring, it's that kind of low level vibration that's very calming and soothing. But that's sort of what it feels like. And the effects have been really powerful. I actually, funny enough, my daughter was having a hard time sleeping last night, and she was just wound up. It was my wife's birthday yesterday, and so of course,
happy birthday.
Yeah, thank you. I'll pass it on to her. But there's birthday stuff, and she's up, she's sugared, and we had whatever, and can't calm down. So I grabbed we read stories, and it's late at night, and it's dark, and she's doing her thing, and she's still kind of jumping around on the bed, but we're trying to fall asleep. And so I get the Apollo, man. I say, do you want to try this? She knows I've been using it. And so I put it on her wrist, and no kidding, within 5 minutes, she's like almost snoring, and I'm like,
wow.
It just conked her out.
Fantastic.
And I think she was tired. She's in that wired and tired state, right?
Right. The overtired state.
The overtired state, exactly, which a lot of us get into. And then we mindlessly kind of wander around, puttering around, doing stuff. I do this at night. And then I'm losing an hour of critical sleep that really affects my performance the next day. So dialing her down through this very, again, non-invasive, just strapping on her wrist and just soothing her, just these sort of gentle, oscillating kind of wave-like vibrations, conked her out, and then I can go to bed too, and then we're all happier. Anyway,
that's so great. I'm so glad to hear that.
So tell me and tell the listeners a little bit more about the technology and how it actually works.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So just going back to something you said earlier, I think your diet in Jordan is I think something very important to comment on, because that's probably something very similar to what my diet was like when I was in medical school, and a lot of us when we're in those kinds of high stress situations, not only because we don't have the time to find better food and better lifestyle choices, but they're also often not readily available. What's really essential about what you mentioned earlier is this idea that you had to, we're talking about retraining and retraining your body to become comfortable with change. And I think and a lot of what Apollo is based on, and the theory that Apollo is based on, and a lot of which is directly related to everything we're talking about, is this idea that we don't often think about in our lives, which is that change itself is a skill. Adaptation is a skill. And the reason why humans have reached the status that we've reached in the world today is because above all other skills that we have the skill of adaptation. And that skill can be highly, highly trained to the point where you can adapt to any situation and come out okay. Or it can be very poorly trained to the point where, somebody looking at you a funny way on the street that you don't even know sets you off. And that is sort of understanding that practice makes perfect, that putting in effort into doing something that seems hard, but then over time becomes a trainable skill is what gets you over that hump that you were talking about earlier, where now you can meditate and do these things, even though you haven't been practicing them for as long as a lot of these other expert folks. You are able to get much more rapid benefit, and you're able to retrain yourself so that you don't have this and follow the same impulses that you followed before.
Right.
And that's really a lot of what Apollo is about. It's about facilitating change responses. So I think the easiest way to understand Apollo is to understand what it doesn't do first and where it came from. And so anybody who's been to a doctor knows that when you go into the doctor and you tell the doctor about all the things, or any healthcare professional, you tell them about all the things in your life that you need help with. And they could range from a whole lot of different things, like anxiety to pain to sleep, etc. And the doctor says to you, okay, this is easy. These are the things that you need to change in your life to solve these problems. And they're saying to you, the patient, change these things in your life. Use your brain from the top down to make behavior change and thought change in your life that is going to be consistent with the lifestyle that you say you want, which is better sleep, better focus, better emotion regulation, etc. The problem with that strategy is that we've been using that strategy for 100 years. And at best, our response rates, which we call adherence rates with our patients, are something like 50%, unless you're treating them with something like antibiotics. When you ask people to actually make behavior change in their lives toward a desired outcome, most people really struggle to do that and to start that retraining process off and to really get things rolling. And so noticing that from our perspective, as in psychiatry, where most of our patients, on the whole, under 50% of our patients actually achieve symptom remission sustained over time, meaning that almost everybody winds up prescribed medication for life, which is not a good situation. Yeah. We are trying to find alternative ways that can help increase the brain and the body's ability to change behavior. And what is change directly related to? It all goes back to the autonomic nervous system. When you feel safe, it's much easier to make change and to adapt to change. When you feel threatened, change all of a sudden becomes scary. And it becomes unfamiliar. Yes. And unfamiliar things by nature, when you're already stressed or sympathetically activated, tend to be more scary. And so, and we know this from decades and decades of literature studying these responses in humans. And so ultimately, if you actually, so what Apollo is doing is, instead of telling you as a doctor to change or a healthcare professional, instead of telling you, change your behavior and then you'll feel better, we're going to say, we're going to make you feel better first using the conserved evolutionary pathways in your nervous system that convey safety, like soothing human touch, which is receptive to things like cat's purrs or bass frequency vibrations layered in very specific ways that then puts your body into a state of feeling calm and safe enough for you to be able to change states more effectively and change behavior more effectively. And so what this really is it's a transition facilitator that does so by providing these gentle, soothing vibrations to the body that help guide you or push you more towards these different states that you're trying to enter, whether they be relaxation and sleepy states or meditative states, or whether those states are flow states or, calm, clear, focused states, or whether those states are wide awake and alert states. And so by changing the frequency patterns that we deliver to your body with Apollo, we can effectively help you transition between all those states better.
It almost sounds like with the technology, with Apollo, you guys are trying to create like a foundation. It's really working on the foundation upon which other things are able to to be built, like a skill set or a particular habit or whatever goal the person has. Does that feel right?
Right. Yeah. In a lot of ways, that is correct. I think that we, and I think one of the common metaphors that we often use in our society is this idea of trickle down, where we think about things going from the top to the bottom. And I think one of the interesting parts of everything we're talking about is that how that does not really apply. Because if you think from top to bottom, we think that the brain is in control all the time and that it's up to us and it's our responsibility to control our brain and control our thoughts and control our bodies and to, consciously change, which ideally we would be able to do that without issue. But ultimately, it's actually more of a bottom-up, trickle-up kind of experience where the nervous system at the core, which the autonomic nervous system, which is at the core of the, as you said, the foundation of all of these system functions and all of the way the body works and all of the way that our cardiovascular and respiratory systems and our nervous systems and immune systems and digestive systems are all interacting with one another. That by hitting that system, that is how we are able to induce the responses that we get. And within sometimes, as you said, 5 minutes for your daughter, we see a response between 2 to 5 minutes on a regular basis. And that's what we've shown in our clinical trials in the lab at the University of Pittsburgh. And so by providing this kind of bottom-up input, it as you said, it hits the foundation of where all of these feelings and these symptoms and the anxiety or whatever it is, the stress that we call stress is coming from, and then allows you to be able to self-regulate better. And so it's really, in a lot of ways, a very powerful self-empowerment tool, because it trains your body to be more balanced over time, not just in the moment. And the more you use it, similar to meditation and mindfulness, the better the effects get over time.
Right. Yep. And that's exactly what the mindfulness research shows, is the more it's cumulative.
Right.
You're reminding me of so much. It's funny, the more you read, the more that it feels like there are kind of root causes a lot of our ills. In fact, I just wrote a little bit about this in my this past week. But I'm thinking of Besser van der Kolk's work on the body keeps the score, with the sort of the way people hold trauma, which is basically sort of like the body believing that it's always like chronically in danger. I'm thinking of sort of Lisa Feldman Barrett's interpretation of how emotion works, where emotion is really just your brain's interpretation or label on an internal state, right? What they call interoception, perception,
exactly.
Interior. So an emotion, and emotions are so can be so mysterious to us, where they come from, why we have them, why we have such strong ones, etc. But really, emotion is sort of an interpretation of of your bodily state. It's your brain's understanding of what's going on inside the entire organism. And so when you affect that organism at that deep level of calming, soothing, like really shifting it into that safe state of your body believing, no, we're good. We're good. We can do rest and digest. We can activate parasympathetic and start doing some of these restorative processes in the body. Then suddenly things like anxiety, angry outbursts, irritability, these things that are actually symptoms. Impulsivity. Yes. This is what we mean by emotion control or emotion regulation, is that when we work from the bottom up, we work with the kind of source or the root of where emotions come from.
Right. And that's exactly why, massage makes us feel good. Gentle, soothing touch makes us feel good. It's exactly why when you're having a bad day and somebody you like comes up to you and holds your hand or gives you a hug, you feel better instantaneously. You may not feel like the problem's solved, but you just feel better. And you feel better because you have a significant safety input coming in that's overwhelming all of the fear responses that you have coming down. And so it's a dynamic balance between these two systems to constantly regulate homeostasis in the body, which is a key word, right? Homeostasis is our ability to come back to resting quickly. and to maintain a resting state in any environment. And what's even more important than homeostasis is another term that's starting to become popular called homeostatic capacity, which is what we work on with Apollo and what mindfulness and meditation work on, which is this idea that the more you train your nervous system to be balanced, the more you practice, the more perfectly balanced your nervous system will get. So the more that you train your body to be in a balanced state in times where you might otherwise be stressed, which is really something interesting about Apollo, right? It's very hard to meditate if you are in Walmart and you have PTSD and you get triggered in line as you're checking out. Yeah. It's easier just to leave, right? And it's easier just to not go back. But if you have something on you that you're wearing, where as soon as you start to get worried or stressed out, or even better, if the technology that like what we're working on can actually detect when you start to get stressed out based on your phone usage, your biometrics, your mobile data, et cetera, then what we can do is we can actually turn on the Apollo frequencies in advance, which helps you reach a more centered place in your nervous system that says, wait, maybe I'm not actually threatened right now. And you actually in real time reappraise the situation and come to a different conclusion that doesn't involve you fighting or flying. And when you have shown yourself that you can do that, just like grabbing a healthy snack rather than the Pepsi, right? You start to change your neurobiology and your neurochemistry and your synaptic connections to favor this other more constructive, positive coping strategy rather than the one you were engaging in for however long before.
Right. It's fascinating. The reappraisal, the idea of reappraisal, I'm always thinking of cognitive reappraisal, right? And reframing, which in positive psychology,
right.
There's a lot of, discussion in cognitive behavioral therapy is largely based around this. I'm thinking of what you're saying as reappraisal from an embodied reappraisal, or it's like you're signaling from the bottom up a reappraisal, which then of course gets the kind of top down match from the cognitive interpretation of that more calm state. Is that how you see it? I don't know if I'm sort
of. Very, very, no, it was very close. The only thing I would change is that what we're doing is we're providing the user of the technology, of the Apollo technology, with a recognizable opportunity to reappraise. So prior, you may not have known that you had another choice because no other choice in your mind has ever worked for you. In your mind, if you've been doing the same thing for your entire life or for 10 years or even for 5 months in response to a certain kind of stress, there may not be another way that you see clearly in that moment anymore, because your initial response is already completely conditioned, right? This goes back to Kandelian learning that dates back millions and millions of years to, animals long before humans were ever on the earth, where we know that if you apply a noxious or threatening stimulus to an animal, it will retract and it will learn to become more sensitive to threat. If you provide a neutral stimulus over time, it can become conditioned or ignored, and what we call habituation. Or positive stimuli can also be trained in the same way. It's similar to the Pavlovian dog experiments. And so it's a lot of reconsolidation, memory reconsolidation, or we call fear reconsolidation, which I'm also kind of using interchangeably with reappraisal, is something that can only happen again when you are already in a position safe enough to be able to recognize the opportunity for it. The opportunities for it are always there. You always have more than one choice. It's just, do you perceive yourself as only having one choice, or do you perceive yourself as having other alternatives? And so as soon as you start perceiving that there are other alternatives, you open up an avenue for you to make other choices and follow those other alternatives. But in the time when you're already wrapped up, it's really, really hard to do that. And so Apollo is just providing the opportunity by bringing you back to your body and making you present and making you feel a little safer in that situation. It provides an opportunity for you to reappraise so that you can understand you have the ability to make a different decision in that situation. And then that ultimately facilitates the cognitive retraining over time.
I love it. Gosh, it's so cool. It is so cool. I'm reading Daniel Siegel's book, Aware, right now, his latest. And it's a fascinating read. It's a heavy read. It's a big read. And he goes into some he dives into some pretty intense stuff that again, you got to be up for the read if you're going to dive into it. But
Sure.
what's interesting as he describes the kind of sea of possible potentialities, right? Of kind of, when you're saying, I hear what you're saying as choice. Like in a moment, if something triggers me, or somebody cuts me off in traffic, or somebody does something rude to me in line at a grocery store, whatever it is,
Right.
that depending on that kind of baseline, but depending on kind of how intense my reaction is, and again, usually it can be a negative reaction. This is what we usually struggle with.
Right.
There's more or less possibility of me acting in a particular way. So if my reaction is sort of mellow, it might be slightly irritated, but still very much in the sea of choice, with these different ways of different possible reactions. I can still feel a little bit, a twinge of kind of irritation when somebody does something.
Right.
But then also give them the benefit of the doubt.
Right.
Go ahead.
Right.
Yeah. And you're allowed to feel irritation.
You're absolutely,
go ahead.
You're absolutely right. And you're allowed to feel those things, right?
Sure.
The emotions themselves, and I think going back to what you were saying earlier, the emotions themselves are real, right? Feelings are real, and we should acknowledge them, and we should give them the respect that they deserve. At the same time, in addition to what you were saying earlier about how the emotion that we feel often gets labeled, and sometimes, or maybe more often than not, mislabeled, which leads to a misinterpretation of the feeling or the experience. I think what's more important about that is that the label of the emotion often is associated with a prejudgment. And so when we experience emotion on the whole, instead of just feeling the way we feel and understanding why we feel that way, or asking ourselves, why do I feel this way, and starting to explore it, ultimately we oftentimes first response is judge ourselves for feeling that way. We judge ourselves for feeling sad or feeling upset or angry. And that brings on additional emotions of shame and guilt and embarrassment. And when those feelings start to come into play, those feelings should be, in a non-prejudged situation, signals to us that says, hey, maybe this isn't the best path of thought. But if that's the way that we've been taught to experience and cope with stress and emotions that we are told are not good to feel, and I would argue that this is a big issue in the field right now. And I think one of the best, and I've probably heard this before, but one of the best movies about it is that animated movie called, do you remember the Pixar animated movie about emotions? Inside Out, yeah.
Inside Out?
That movie does an amazing job because it shows how all of the emotions dynamically interact together, and that none of them are bad. They're just there. And so you're allowed to feel them without feeling bad for feeling. Once you get to the point where you allow yourself to feel without judging yourself for feeling, then that allows you to accurately interpret the emotions that you're experiencing and make the better decisions based on those signals that you're getting from your body. But if you are in a fearful state, or you've been in a fearful state for a very long time, you're not going to be as likely to be able to approach those experiences coming in a non-judgmental way. And so we wind up more likely to label, more likely to judge not only our feelings, but also ourselves, which all is directly contradictory to our ability to change. And so it's really, when we talk about like relearning what it means to be human, it's really about relearning everything down to the core of the way that we use words, as you said earlier, to describe our feelings and how we look at ourselves. And being able to look at yourself in a non-judgmental way and look at your experience and your signals and from your body in a non-judgmental way is ultimately what is going to facilitate your skill of listening to your body and being better and healthier, because you're bringing more balance and regulation into the situation. You're removing the resistance, the judgment that ultimately long-term creates an enormous amount of suffering.
Wow. Yeah, it's really interesting, Dave. I was sort of, I'm in a moment right now where I'm trying to allow myself to feel negative emotions. And I know that sounds
It's
sort of like
hard.
a bizarre thing to have to work on, but I was really taught in much to, you know, we are all raised in the way we're raised, but I was raised in my dad in particular was very optimistic, and in many ways I credit that richness of optimism with a lot of who I am today, you know. So there's a lot of positive to this.
Right.
The flip side of it, which I only kind of slowly coming to terms with, is that I did kind of feel like it wasn't really okay to feel negative emotions, like thinking of that inside out,
Right.
right? If fear or anger, especially anger, um, or sadness or disgust or, you know, whatever it was, that what I would do with those emotions, because they became socially unacceptable to express, even if it was
Right.
done not in a harmful way to others, if it was just done in a need to kind of get them out of my body and feel seen or heard, or
Yeah.
as an expression of hurt, right? We often get angry when we feel hurt. It's actually hurt, which is what
Right.
happened, but we express it as aggression or anger, right? What I would end up doing is just kind of stuffing those negative emotions and just bottling them, you know, and not, you know, not knowing what to do with them. Just knowing that, like,
Right.
unless I had a smile on my face, it was sort of like, well, I just needed to find a way to deal with the negative emotions. So in many ways, one of my coping strategies, my meta patterns that I find is that I'll distance, right? I'll go off on my own. I'll read.
Right.
I'll do something that's not, which I don't think is necessarily inherently bad, unless I'm not dealing with, unless it's interpersonal and I'm not engaging in the negative emotion in
Right.
order to process through it constructively. And it is fascinating how deep that runs in our collective psychology, that negative emotions are bad.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think one of the major areas of focus that we've been exploring, and that I think is really critical to cognitive retraining and sort of the, you know, the quintessential ideas behind things like CBT and DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, and interpersonal, interfamily systems therapy, and all of these other different therapies that really work well for people when they engage, is the engagement, right? You have to be engaged in treatment, whether that's with just you and yourself, or whether it's you and your therapist, or you and your coach, or whatever it is. You have to be bought in to the experience of change, and to be able, and so when and that's where the 4 pillars really come in, you know, because it's one thing to try to just start doing all of these things amidst all of the other stuff that we have going on in our lives without any preparation. And we'll say, oh, you know, well, I tried and I failed, but, you know, I put in a good effort. But even if you did, you probably weren't doing it right, because you weren't most people at least don't take the time to really work on the foundation of what all of this stuff is built on. And the foundation of all this stuff has to be built on not insecurity, but a trust in oneself. And the trust in oneself comes from practicing skills like gratitude, forgiveness, compassion, and self-love, which are the 4 pillars of the foundation of almost every single modern religion known to man. And these are so consistent across religions, because these 4 skill sets, if you practice them as simply as waking up every morning and before you go to bed saying, you know, I am grateful for the fact that I made it here today, and that I get to see and live another day. And I'm grateful for the fact that I did everything that I did to get myself here, right? So you're expressing self-gratitude, forgiveness for the things that you did wrong, that might have been mistakes that you felt you made along the way. You still made it here. You still have an enormous amount to be grateful for. So you're going to learn from your mistakes, and it's okay to make them, because making mistakes is part of the path, right? And then compassion for all the mistakes you will make in the future and for others, and understanding that, you know, you're not going to be perfect the first time. Practice makes perfect. And you've been practicing things a different way for however many years. It's going to take a good amount of time for you to to retrain yourself. So, you know, go into it with a sense of not expecting everything from the beginning. And then that all leads into self-love, which is this idea of not trying to make yourself better because you hate yourself and you don't think you're good enough, but trying to make yourself the best person that you can be, because you want to grow as a person and be fulfilled and in touch with yourself and trust yourself. And all of that forms that foundation of self-trust. And once you have, built your foundation and strengthened your foundation of self-trust, then you can start to really add on all these other things like, these health practices and get a much more dramatic benefit. I think you can still get benefit from doing them without the foundation, but the benefits after you've built a foundation will last for a much longer time because they have something to sit on. And that will stick with you over time and allow you to more effectively, move forward with other sort of cognitive retraining activities. But all of that is sort of, so fundamental to, all of this self-healing work that we do. And ultimately, when we allow ourselves to trust ourselves, that is when we can truly allow ourselves to feel and to listen to ourselves without labeling and without judgment. And so when we get to that point, and this is something, of course, takes practice. So, be nice to yourself. It's gonna take some time.
Yeah.
But as you practice just thinking about yourself and thinking about these things in different ways, ultimately what that will allow you to do is something incredibly powerful that we found separates people who are mentally ill from people who are superstars. And one of the major things that they do that's different, people who are the superstars, who might have been equally or more traumatized than the folks who succumb to mental or physical illness, is that these people channel their negative emotions. Right? They don't just let anger take over and yell at everybody or become violent or aggressive. They understand that they have a certain emotion and maybe they have it a lot and maybe they don't enjoy the way they feel, but they have to do something about it, and they'd rather do something constructive and productive for them that's rewarding rather than doing something destructive that's impulsive. And so instead of using drugs or instead of, doing any number of other non-constructive activities, people will channel their anger into things like entrepreneurship and business, right? They'll channel their anger into personal development, and they will use that energy to help move them forward to become better and faster and stronger and more resilient. Because really all of these names that we give to emotions are just names for different kinds of energy. The question is, what do you do with that energy? Remember, just like we were talking about when we first started this conversation, once you have the information and understand what is true and what is not true and what you can do with the information you have, what do you actually then decide to do?
Yep. Yeah, I love it. I love the idea of getting mad and then going for a run as a way to defeat anger, because that's what your body actually is asking you to do. It's like a constructive, it's very matched with our biological origin of the upset.
Yep.
And
you just and that energy just comes right out through your body and then serves to clear your mind, which is why running is such a fantastic activity, or any kind of exercise for that matter.
I'm also reminded as you're talking of Kristen Neff's research on self-compassion, and how hard it is for people to wrap their head around. It's talking about retraining our kind of whole experience of humanity, of our kind of lives, right? And what it means to be human. It's so hard to really start walking into, for some reason, for a lot of us, it's really hard to walk into that space of self-care and self-compassion and self-kindness, right? To treat ourselves the way we would treat a good friend if they were struggling.
Right.
Or to treat ourselves the way we would talk to a small child, who is struggling with something. To talk to our own self-talk, to reflect that kind of kind, gentle, encouraging, is in many ways been shown empirically to be one of these root causes, as you're describing, as being a necessary ingredient for change. And without it, we get stuck. We don't progress.
Right, and so in some cases we actually regress, which is really the unfortunate situation. But I think what you brought up is really important. I think that exact thing you just mentioned about your being your own best friend. I use that with my patients almost first thing when we meet, when we come into the office and they're talking about a problem they've had that week or the week before or whatever, and they talk about how they're judging themselves for their reaction and for what happened and blaming themselves for the problem, blaming other people. And then then I ask them after they tell me the whole thing, I say, now tell me how you would react to this if it was your best friend telling you all of these things that you just told me.
Yeah.
And all
Right.
of a sudden, a little light bulb goes off in their heads, and they're like, "Wow, I really treat myself terribly."
Yeah.
Even
It's
if
a
they
real
don't say
surprise
it,
for people. Yeah.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
wow, I'm
because
really
we've
a
been
jerk to
taught.
myself.
Right, and part of that is, again, going back to a deeply indoctrinated principle in our minds, which is that to be afraid of failure, right? To be afraid of making mistakes. Why should we be afraid of something that's inevitable? It's like being afraid of death. You know, nobody's signing, we're not necessarily saying we want to sign on the line and seal the date for our demise or for our, future
Right.
failure,
Right.
but but it's living in the present enough to be able to understand that these things are going to happen. And you're
Yeah.
not going to necessarily do anything to try to make it more likely. You're probably going to do whatever you can to make it less likely
Yeah.
that it's going to happen in soon or in the way that you don't want it to, but you're still accepting that it is inevitable that you will at some point have these experiences. And so if we can teach people that from a very young age, that's really the best way to do it is, really hit kids when they're young and learning about what it means to make mistakes and what it means to fail. And instead show them that instead of looking at it as shameful and guilty, you can equally have an opportunity to see these things as an opportunity for growth. And so challenge is an opportunity for growth, right? Nietzsche said, what does not kill us makes us stronger. And that's not about physical injury. That's about us overcoming challenge in our lives that allows us to develop as people and become more enriched human beings. If we didn't have challenge, we would be nothing because we would never have the drive to learn anything. Everything would be handed to us. But challenge is what makes us resilient. Overcoming challenge and challenging ourselves to continuously grow and get better is what the drive to make us continuously stronger, better individuals and better organisms, and better to ourselves and better to others, because it facilitates a constant pattern of growth rather than stagnation. And so that's another thing that's at the core of shifting our concepts on this, is really just understanding, that failure is not something to be afraid of. It's something that's there, that you might as well get used to it right now. And then when you have the foresight to see that, then do whatever you can to plan ahead to avoid it.
Yeah.
But if you ignore it, it's going to catch up with you and you're going to have a much more unpleasant experience.
Wow. Dave, this was this was so helpful. I mean, literally, like, if for those who are listening, the wisdom that's coming out of Dave's mouth right now, if you can apply this in your life, it's really getting to, in my mind, to root causes of a lot of our suffering and pain, and on the flip side, a lot of our flourishing and happiness. So Dave, I just want to, I want to make sure our listeners can find you. Where do they look to find you, follow you, to find Apollo Neuroscience, etc.?
Yeah, thanks, James. This has been a really great conversation. I really appreciate you having me, and thank you for your kind words. I want to let everybody know that, first off, almost all the things that I've been talking about here with James can be found in ancient scriptures that are probably well documented online about ancient Buddhist and Hindu culture, because, they really have spent an enormous amount of time focusing on and tribal culture as well, but focusing on the understanding of these four pillars and the foundations of thought that seem to elude a lot of us in Western health. But a lot of this stuff is available, and I think when you really do go back and look at the original sources, the origins, you can see how truly ingrained in humans these kinds of things really are. They're not something that we're just making up now after learning about the science. We're actually now finding that the science explains principles that we've understood as humans for thousands and thousands of years. But in terms of if anybody who wants to find me or reach out to me, you can go to apolloneuro.com, and from apolloneuro.com you can access information about our technology, and you can sign up to beta tests, and soon you'll be able to see where we're speaking at different conferences around the world. We'll be at Rio 2C in Brazil in the end of April, and then at Summit in Tulum in May.
Nice.
And then there's a few others coming up. And then you can also find me at Twitter if you want to reach out to me directly, at Dave Rabin.
Perfect. Yeah. So if anybody's interested in following their work, apolloneuro.com, reach out to Dave, follow him on Twitter. And Dave, also, when can people expect, I know the product isn't available, you can't quite purchase it yet, but when do you sort of hope for that to be available for people?
So the Apollo technology will be available for pre-sale in the spring, May or June, and the technology itself will be commercially released and available in the fall of 2019. So pretty soon. So
Awesome.
Sign up on our website, and if you're interested, and we'll be happy to share updates with you and let you know how things are moving as we move closer and closer towards production.
Love it. Dave, thank you again so much for being on the show. It's been such a pleasure. This was such a fun conversation.
Yeah, this was really great. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.